Dear friends, welcome to those of you on Zoom. It's wonderful to see you up there. We're so grateful that Caroline accepted the invitation from Gifts and Leadings to share her spiritual journey and her ministries. And this has really been part of a year-long program where we've invited friends to share personally about how they have been led and the work that they've been called to do and how they have tried to live so faithfully, for which we are very grateful. Today is an experiment. Up until today, the programs have been entirely on Zoom. This is a blended program, and I'm very grateful to the people, Nancy Van Arkel, who said it could be done, hooray, and Aaron Buchner and Jonathan Kendall in Amsterdam, who also provides technical assistance, which is wonderful. So we will settle into silence, and Caroline will speak out of the silence. And then when she's done, we'll go into worship sharing, although she is willing to answer some questions. But let us try to hold on to the spirit of worship. Thank you.
Good afternoon, friends. First of all, can you hear me? My talk is called Seeds and Fruits of a Spiritual Journey, and I hope to start by talking about some of the early seeds of my journey. Do you remember when you were 12? What was going through your mind? What were you concerned about? When I was 12, my father had a business trip to Japan and decided to take my mother and me with him. We stopped in Hawaii on the way, and I had a chance to take surfing lessons at Waikiki Beach. It was thrilling. When we arrived in Japan, we received many stares, as at that time there were not many Americans there. We visited some typical tourist places such as gardens and temples, but my parents also deliberately traveled to be in Hiroshima on August 6th for the commemoration of the atomic bomb drop. Many years later, in 2012, I took a workshop at FGC about digital storytelling and chose to create this story of my experience that summer. So I'm hoping you will now be able to see the short film that I created at that time.
Yep, give me 1 second.
I am a pacifist. It was 1967. LBJ was president, and my country was in the midst of the Vietnam War. I was 12, and in the midst of a summer filled with camp, being a bridesmaid, and a family. Aaron, we're not hearing the video. We're not seeing the video.
Oh, 1 moment, please.
So this is an experiment, and we have opportunities for expectant waiting.
Friends, can you see the video now?
Yes, I think it's, there we go. pacifist. It was 1967.
Can you see and hear it now?
LBJ was president, and my country was in the midst of the Vietnam War. I was 12, and in the midst of a summer filled with camp, being a bridesmaid, and a family trip to Japan and Hawaii. I was very shy, skinny, and wore glasses. On August 6th, my parents and I went to Hiroshima for the commemoration of the 1945 bombing of that city. Many people gathered to hear speeches and to watch the release of 100 doves, a symbol of peace. We stuck out like sore thumbs. We were tall, we were Americans, and I had bright red hair. Everyone else had straight black hair. Some wore traditional kimonos. We took photos of the only building that remained standing after the bombing of Hiroshima, and of people praying at the eternal flame.
We are not seeing the
I thought
video
the Japanese
anymore.
people would hate us. After all, our country had dropped the bomb that destroyed their city.
Could we
But
start
they
again?
smiled
the
and
video?
welcomed us, me especially. We went to the Children's Peace Memorial, built in honor of Sadako Sasaki. She was a 2-year-old child living just outside of Hiroshima when the bomb dropped. She survived without burns or injuries and lived a healthy life, even running and winning races at school until she was 11. Then she became ill with leukemia. She died a few months later, on the day I celebrated my first birthday. When the Japanese people learned that I was 12, the age of Sadako Sasaki when she died, they were very moved. They gave me leis of paper cranes to place at the foot of the memorial. I became a symbol to them. As we mingled in the crowd, teenage boys approached me and tried to speak English. I was flattered. They asked the sentences they had learned in school. How old are you? What movies do you like? And then they asked questions that I couldn't answer. Why is your country in Vietnam? Why is the United States fighting a war? I didn't know. I had never thought about it. I didn't have an answer, but it seemed very, very wrong. In Japan, people were still dying from the radiation effects of the Hiroshima bomb. But my country was fighting another war in a country far away. Why? The experience of Hiroshima created in me a deep conviction of the immorality of war. It led me to an awareness of my country as a wrongdoer and made me identify as a Quaker. It was also deeply moving that I, an American, was so welcomed despite the transgressions of my country. This was one of the deep seeds. Another seed that was planted early was a sense of awe for the natural world. Although I had many experiences of being out of doors and at camps during my childhood, the appreciation of nature deepened during my second year of college when I joined a 3-week trip to the Boundary Waters of Canada, where we canoed in pristine wilderness areas. The water was clean enough to drink. We heard loons nearly every day, surprised a moose around a bend one time, and didn't see any other humans for weeks. The trip was designed to challenge students in every way. I gained self-confidence from meeting physical challenges like carrying a heavy Duluth pack on my back during portages, swimming a mile across a lake, and paddling against heavy waves on wide lakes. I was challenged spiritually by spending 3 days on a solo experience with no food or shelter. I was challenged psychologically by the requirement to try rock climbing, which I found terrifying and repelling. A year later, I took a NOLS trip, or National Outdoor Leadership School trip, to the Wind Rivers in Wyoming. It was similarly impactful. And one of the things I will never forget is a night when we were camping on glaciers, and I stepped out of the tent and saw all of the stars. It seemed like all of the stars of the universe above me. And in the daytime, there was snow, and later alpine meadows and flowers. It was so beautiful. It's a space I go back to when asked to meditate. I changed my college major to biology, and after college thought I was headed towards environmental education. I wanted to work with children and out of doors, sharing a love and understanding of nature, and then took a long circuitous route. After a short stint at Natural History Museum in Pittsburgh, I was hired to work at Camp Kern, Oregonia, Ohio, leading outdoor education for upper elementary students. It was a mostly wonderful experience. We led students on night hikes where we often heard owls and spotted frogs and salamanders in spring ponds. We walked by day through a climax forest and heard pileated woodpeckers. We dug for trilobites in a fossil-rich stream bed. But the food was awful, and the pay was a pittance. When I started, I earned $35 a week, plus free room and free meals during the week, but not on the weekend. It was a pretty unsustainable work situation. I thought more education was the answer, so I left to pursue a graduate school program for environmental education. The program was stimulating, and I completed my degree in what was called Interpretive Services Administration, prepared to go teach at a museum or living history site or park, but it didn't lead to a career in environmental education. Instead, I made another complete career shift. My desire to work with children and to remain in one place for a time won out over hopping all over the country seeking work in environmental education with brief encounters with children. I wanted to make stronger relationships with young children. And the only place that seemed likely to happen was in a school setting. So I sought work as an elementary teacher, for which I was untrained and unprepared. That brought me to Friends Select School, which at that time had an internship program for people considering a career in teaching. After a year of training and practicum at Friends Select, I taught at Frankfurt Friends School for 4 years, second grade, including several of the children of the meeting at that time, Jason Hammett and Brett Hart, and also Jesse White, who now teaches at Pendle Hill. Longing for more adventure and having no serious romantic relationship to keep me in Philadelphia, I looked for positions abroad, following Sandy Ray and Stephanie Judson to the Friends School in Ramallah. Of course, as it happened shortly before my interview, I began a relationship with Bill Sanderson that looked promising. So when interviewed, I promised only to serve for 1 year rather than 2. I taught at the Ramallah Friends Girls' School for 1 year from 1985 to 86. Bill and I married in June of 1987. And the impact of Ramallah on my spiritual journey is another story to be told another time. A few months after we married, Bill and I purchased a large house in West Philadelphia, much too big for the two of us. From the start, it was our intention to share our house through offering hospitality, to be welcoming to strangers as I had been welcomed long ago. Various people lived with us for short periods of time as our children were growing up. In 2003, I learned about the organization called Hosts for Hospitals, which provided free lodging for out-of-town families of patients being treated in local hospitals. We signed up to be hosts, and that led us to unexpected consequences. Most families are from within the United States, but occasionally families come from abroad. We got a call in April about a mother and child from Haiti who needed housing for 2 weeks, long enough for surgery to be completed at Wills Eye Hospital. The child had advanced retinoblastoma, a cancer of the eye. Her mother had sought treatments for nearly a year, but doctors in Haiti either misdiagnosed her or said they could do nothing. Finally, she connected with an organization that brings children to the United States for medical treatments unavailable in their own countries. She arrived on April 18th, 2003. I was intrigued because the mother was French-speaking and I had studied French long ago in high school. Another neighbor from our block was Haitian-born and spoke both Creole and French. So she went with me to meet Marie and her daughter, Jael, at the airport. As soon as we got to the car, we introduced Jael to a new torturous device known as a car seat. Initially, Jael, who was 18 months old, was terrified of our beagle dog and would not leave her mother's lap. She was also in great pain from a double ear infection. After a first visit to Wills Eye, they determined that Jael's tumor was too large to be removed. She would need to have chemotherapy to shrink the tumor first. Her stay was extended. Her ear infection was treated and chemotherapy was begun. After her first treatment, Jael got down out of her mother's lap and began to pet the dog. Clearly, she felt less pain and seemed better. Erin, you could start the next series of slides. So this is Jael and her mother. They came to meeting, and this is in front of the Mary Dyer statue. I was keenly aware when they were visiting of the situations that we were in and whether they would be the only persons of color. So that was not true at meeting. It was not true at our swim club. It was not true at Lansdowne Friends School. So I was grateful that I did not live in a world that was completely white. Erin, you could show the next slide. This is what she looked like in the summer of 2003. After another month, a family on the block agreed to host Marie and Jael. Treatments continued. After chemotherapy, there were many radiation treatments, each of which required anesthesia. 2 other families on the block with French speakers helped with everything: meals, transportation to the many appointments, toys, a stroller, companionship. Jael blossomed, began to speak a combination of French, Creole, and English, and Marie began to pick up more English. You can show the next slide. So there she's playing with our beagle dog. Next slide. It's another picture of her. She was really kind of an imp, and she loved to stick out her tongue and to point to her shoes. She was very, very proud of her shoes. Despite all of her medical treatments, she was a happy and playful child that summer, always eager to point to her beautiful shoes. In October, we began to plan for a birthday party for her 2nd birthday. Next slide, please. I attended many of the chemo sessions with Marie and Jael and often did some of the simpler translations. One day, they asked us to wait while they obtained the official translator who spoke fluent Creole. They needed the translator to convey the bad news. The cancer had returned. She would not live long. Within 2 weeks, she needed morphine for the pain. She was unable to sleep. We finally took her to Children's Hospital, anticipating many days of slow decline. I offered to take the first night's shift so that her mother would not be alone with her in the hospital. Jael passed away that night. Her mother stepped out of the room, afraid to be present at the moment of death. So a nurse and I saw her take her final breaths. The neighbors and our meeting gathered to provide a funeral service and burial. One neighbor, pictured here in the red shirt, a pastor, conducted the funeral service at her church and the graveside service. Our meeting donated a plot for the burial. Next slide. In the picture you can see the little girl is my daughter Margie throwing dirt on the casket. She's surrounded by neighbors. Neighbors and friends helped pay for the funeral service, the casket, the headstone. And the neighbors held a huge porch sale to raise money to help her mom, who did not want to return to Haiti. This left a big hole. We'd grown to love Jael, and it was devastating that she passed. We had become really hopeful, but that was not to be. We put her mom on a bus to Florida, where she had a childhood friend. We stayed connected, and I began to learn what it's like to be at the very bottom of the U.S. society, to be female, non-English speaking, a person of color, an illegal immigrant, destitute, and grieving. I learned to recognize my own privileges through the mirror of her life. She survived. She found employment and housing. She learned English. She married. She had a son. She became a licensed nurse practitioner, and she is now a U.S. citizen. We have laughed and cried and grieved and celebrated together. I visited her once when she had great pain in her mouth, and we went to a dentist, and she had her wisdom teeth extracted. That was her first visit to a dentist. When her son was born, I came to be with them. I was a member of her wedding party when she and her husband of 12 years had a full-scale church wedding. I was with her the week before Bill's father passed away, and I was with her again just days before my mother died. For me, she is a touchstone of life in a very different piece of America. One more slide. This is her gravestone at the burial ground, which was outside of the norms at that time, because it doesn't just say the name and date, it says Je t'aime, or I love you. So fast forward to 2007 or 2008. Although my concern about the environment was not new by any means, by 2008 I became convinced that climate change was clearly the greatest threat to mankind, humankind. I had turned away from environmental education as a career and had become a teacher of English as a second language at Temple University. Many of my students were from Saudi Arabia, one of the world's biggest oil producers. I hoped that I could combine my concern for the environment by teaching and impacting my students, by focusing my writing classes on topics related to the threats to the environment and creative solutions. And during that year, my students did indeed read many interesting, pertinent articles related to climate change, but it didn't have a great impact on them. And by the end of the year, I knew this was not enough. I already knew that changing my own habits and reducing my own carbon footprint was inadequate, but I didn't know what to do. Nevertheless, I decided to quit my job and devote my time and efforts to environmental work. I resigned my job in June of 2009. I remember meeting with Pat McBee that summer. She was the executive director of Friends Center, and she had done so much to enable the geothermal wells and other sustainable aspects of the renovation of Friends Center. She had a real commitment to the environment. I don't recall what we said, but my meeting with her was like a clearness committee of one for me. I felt clear to leave my job indefinitely. I then began to look for possible employment, working with environmental organizations such as Penn Future, Clean Air Council, Philadelphia Horticultural Society, and so forth. Quickly, I discovered that once again, I didn't have the experience or the training or the preparation needed for these jobs. I concluded I would need to work as a volunteer. It just so happened that George Lakey gave a keynote speech about climate change at Philadelphia Yearly Meeting that summer. At the end of it, one young friend said, "Show me the way." That led to a series of living room conversations that fall about what Quakers could do to tackle climate change. And I was lucky enough to be invited to join these conversations. Equate was born out of those conversations. I was impatient and eager to do something bigger than a carbon footprint to mitigate climate change. The idea of a campaign, a sustained effort against a specific target or decision maker with a defined goal, was new to me, but it made sense. It was also very different from the forms of protest I had been familiar with, starting with huge marches against the war in Vietnam in the 1970s, continuing to candlelight vigils against the impending war in Iraq in 1991, and even to a recent climate rally by 350 to call attention to 350 parts per million of CO2 as a goal to strive for. Equate was named after AQAG, a Quaker Action Group. And I recall the beginning of Earthquaker Action Team as the day on which George Willoughby passed away. And it seemed as though his spirit and activism immediately passed into Equate. We chose to pursue PNC Bank and demand that they stop funding coal companies that practiced mountaintop removal coal mining, a form of strip mining that was so extreme that it required dynamiting the tops off mountains. Excess material was dumped into nearby valleys and streams, polluting the water as well as the air near these sites. In addition, this type of mining was capital intensive and not labor intensive, so far fewer workers were needed, exacerbating the shortage of jobs in the declining coal industry. We called the campaign BLAM, or Bank Like Appalachia Matters, exclamation point. Because I was eager, willing, and mostly unemployed, I became the clerk of this newly formed organization, almost by default. We launched our campaign in February 2010. Equate eventually won our campaign with PNC. After 5 years and 125 actions, PNC changed their policy to eliminate funding for coal companies engaged in mountaintop removal mining. I don't want to talk about the details of the campaign here, but how participation in this campaign changed me and bore fruit in my own spiritual journey. From the start, I was challenged to be on my growing edge and to take risks and challenges I hadn't done before. Being a part of Equate forced me to become bolder. That began almost immediately when we launched our campaign in February of 2010. 3 of us, George Lakey, Ingrid Lakey, and myself, met with the regional president of PNC Bank. We promised to shine a light on PNC's practices. I think they assumed that a polite meeting with us would be enough to make us go away. Even though we had been invited to meet with them after we had requested that meeting, it felt risky just to go up the elevator to the executive's office and present our demands. Equate met frequently that spring, initially every week, then every other week, then monthly. Each time we met, I learned more about strategy, tactics, and nonviolent campaigns. By the time summer came around, I had enough training to take on organizing my first action. George Lakey gave a talk at FGC that year, and he talked a lot about Equate, stirring up interest. With one other Equate member, I organized a noontime action at a local PNC branch in Bowling Green, Ohio. The action was relatively simple compared to later ones. It involved standing outside the branch with signs and leaflets, and my son juggling in order to get attention, and a couple of us going inside the branch and speaking directly to the branch manager. That would have been me and Gail Newbold. It was a frightening new step for me. The next bold step I took was in September. Equate went to Washington, D.C. to join a large group of activists protesting mountaintop removal mining. That protest was called Appalachia Rising. We decided that our action in D.C. would be to occupy a PNC bank located near the White House. We joined with folks from RAN, or Rainforest Action Network, as well as the Reverend Billy and the Church of Stop Shopping Choir. We brought a large tarp into the bank and dumped dirt on it, representing the destroyed mountains of Appalachia. We then sat around this tarp in a large circle. When we refused to leave, the bank manager panicked, called the police, and locked the doors to the bank. The police came, knocking on the doors, since they too were locked out, looked at us, asked us what we were going to do, and said, "We'll come back later. We have other things to do." We then had an unexpected long period inside the bank where we began a spontaneous worship sharing time. Some sang, we were with a choir, some spoke, and there were periods of silence. This continued for a few hours. Erin, can you show the next slides? This isn't that particular bank action, but we had many, many opportunities to worship inside PNC banks. Next slide. At nearly every bank occupation where we sat down in worship, there was a sense of calm, of expectant waiting, of trust and community. At the bank in D.C., there was also a shock in realizing that we had shut down a bank for several hours. We were more powerful than we thought we could be. Just a moment. Being a part of an activist group was very important to me, but it also led me back to worship. And years later, I twice took the opportunity to take a workshop at FGC with Christopher Salmond called Opening to the Heart of Worship. And I want to quote something from a handout that he provided. Worship with depth and power cannot be ordered up or made to happen. There are, however, conditions we can impact and practices on our part which can make this treasured experience more likely to happen or less so. In short, worship doesn't just happen. It's something we make together, and what we bring to that experience will shape the quality of that worship. One condition which makes us more accident-prone to enter into spiritually powerful worship is a depth of community characterized by trust and knowing each other, of being able to be open in heart and spirit with each other. If it doesn't feel safe to open our hearts to the others in the room, it is difficult, if not nigh on impossible, to open them to God. So my experiences in this bank and in subsequent banks was a deepening of worship for me. The activism led me into worship, and my spiritual grounding led me into activism. They were mutually interdependent. Though I risked arrest that day in Washington, D.C., I was not arrested. The police returned and, almost at our request, agreed to arrest 4 persons of our choosing. We selected 2 men and 2 women, and I was not among them. Another change happened within me next spring. Both Ingrid Lakey and I took something called the Organizing Skills Institute offered by Training for Change. Among the many challenges was a carefully coached lesson and practice in street speaking, or speaking on a street corner in public. I was very apprehensive about doing this, as were others. I was quite surprised to discover that not only could I do this, but I was pretty good at it, and I even enjoyed it. I found my voice. At some later point, I was in Pittsburgh, and there was a protest going on about something, not exactly mountaintop removal mining, maybe it was fracking, but there was an opportunity for attenders to speak, and I leapt up to the microphone and began talking about mountaintop removal and PNC Bank's complicity. I had no hesitation. This was new for me. This ability to speak also had an impact on me in worship. I had grown up as a Quaker, but very, very rarely spoke in meeting. A good bit of that was pure shyness. Now that changed. I recall that at my mother-in-law's memorial service in the spring of 2011, I sang in worship, probably for the first time. I became able to speak in ways that were not accessible to me previously. Not every week, not frequently, but whenever I felt moved to do so. I became able to be faithful to what Spirit wanted me to share. I had other opportunities to speak, and to speak out of turn. At the PNC shareholder meetings, at a PNC shareholders meeting in Pittsburgh, a group of us joined the shareholder meeting. We had bought shares so that we could do this. And we interrupted numerous times, calling out each time a board member's name and singing, "Which side are you on, PNC? Which side are you on? Which side are you on, PNC? Which side are you on?" Next slide. Let's try the next slide. Okay. At another shareholder meeting, this time with Exelon, I was able to speak directly with Chris Crane, the CEO of Exelon, challenging him to answer our questions about PECO's inadequate grid. A group of us went into the shareholder meeting, and one person took pictures, which were definitely not permitted. So that was the only picture that was taken inside that shareholder meeting. I was stunned when Chris Crane offered to meet with us. A meeting was scheduled, but PECO put up preliminary meetings and obstacles and showed no interest in budging. Then Equate, finding PECO not amenable, dropped an enormous banner off their green roof that said, "Climate is changing, why isn't PECO?" And PECO canceled the meeting. But it was an astonishing moment. Another slide. Just another opportunity when I was speaking. This was during the green walk around Philadelphia. But there were many, many opportunities. Okay, now you can go back to the slide with the PNC banner. Yes, thank you. Another growth edge for me occurred at the Philadelphia Flower Show in 2011. For the second year in a row, we were protesting the irony of PNC's sponsorship of the lovely flower show while also investing in the destruction of forests, flowers, and entire mountains in Appalachia. After paying for tickets to enter the show, we put up yellow caution tape and held signs that said PNC the Mountaintop Removal Bank and Flower Crime Scene. 9 of us were prepared to risk arrest. Of course, the managers of the show were eager for us to leave and for us to minimize our disruptive presence. I recall one of the managers asking me to move in to take up a little less space, and I said, no. I wasn't angry or belligerent, but I held my ground. It was new for me to resist being polite, being automatically compliant with expectations, and saying no is still hard for me to do, but it is something that I'm still learning, that Equate has helped me to learn. Okay, next slide. There, thank you. I risked arrest for the 3rd time in December 2011, along with 4 others. You might recognize Vint Deming on the right, Lee Reinhardt, Ryan Leitner, and to the left of me, Gail Newbold. This time, we occupied a PNC bank in Philadelphia. We brought in large windmills and spoke and sang vigorously, putting PNC Bank on trial for its responsibility for MTR. After the police were called and we were given 2 warnings, the non-arrestables left the bank, leaving only the 5 of us. We were arrested. Next slide. And taken to a jail approximately under the Whole Foods store in Center City. Lee was unfortunately separated from the rest of us after she admitted to being hypoglycemic. They took her alone to the roundhouse. The others of us stayed put for many hours, often singing. Vint was in the next cell so we could hear him. They brought us very small bottles of water and sandwiches of white bread with Velveeta cheese. At 3 a.m., they moved the 4 of us to the roundhouse, and I spent the remaining hours in a small cell with 2 other women who were FOJs, or fugitives of justice. In other words, they were arrested for crimes in other states. I spent nearly 24 hours in jail, experiencing pain anger, compassion, and gratitude. The pain came from the sheer misery of the experience. The food was awful and inadequate. The cells were cold and had no beds. I attempted to sleep on my raincoat on the floor, but I didn't sleep at all. The guards deliberately separated us from one another in the roundhouse and then put 3 people in small 6-foot by 8-foot cells when other cells were available. The anger came from seeing the huge waste of resources spent on jailing people for small crimes, the visible street crimes, and the lack of penalty for those in executive suites destroying mountains or the environment or the future. It was obvious that jail was designed for poor people. The compassion came from seeing the dehumanization of both the prisoners and the guards in the jail system. The environment itself is ugly, windowless, cold, and the guards and the prisoners are disempowered. No one has information, no one has control over who will arrive, when they will leave, or what will happen. And finally, the gratitude came from getting out of jail, appreciating all the comforts and freedoms of being out of jail. Sleep, a glass of water, a kind word or gesture, decent food, the chance to look out a window or step outside. In the winter of 2013 to 2014, the movement against the KXL pipeline was gaining more and more attention. At the request of the national movement against the KXL pipeline, Equate agreed to coordinate trainings and lead a protest in Philadelphia. Equate led 6 trainings, and more than 200 people showed up at the federal building on a cold morning in March. Last month, Ingrid described the moment of worship that was called for outside, which gradually swept over the crowd with a powerful silence. I was one of the 29 people arrested that day. We were each handcuffed and taken to a cell below the federal building, all the women in one cell and all the men in an adjacent cell. While we were in the cell, we began singing. First to Anne Yasuhara, who was ill and unable to be with us. Courage, Anne, you do not walk alone. We will walk with you and sing your spirit home. We sang to everyone present, everyone in the cells, and then to the guards, as I recall. We were ministering to one another. Again, this was a very worshipful time in jail. Next slide. This is a group of us outside the federal building. You might recognize Pat Finley and, again, Vint Deming. Next slide. My handcuffs had been put on so tightly that my fingers began to get numb, and then I fainted. The guards let me out of the cell and cut off the handcuffs so I could recover. When I was no longer faint, they put them back on again, but not quite so tightly this time. So I had a real experience of being held in the light and being cared for by those in the jail. Part of Equate's culture is to encourage each other to try new things to stay on our edge. Sometimes that showed up in small things. At one meeting in George's house, I played the piano. Someone remarked on this, and I said I didn't enjoy playing the piano in public, but it was one of the things that was on my edge to do. As Equate's first clerk, I ended up clerking both our general meetings and also our board meetings. Sometimes I didn't do a great job of this. Sometimes I found it difficult, but I didn't know how to do it better. I received some painful feedback from a wise and experienced trainer who felt that, frankly, I shouldn't be the one to clerk the meetings. I finally confronted him and asked him to watch me run a meeting and give me feedback and guidance. He did so, and I learned to be more of a facilitator, watching the energy of a meeting and making sure it had oomph, and less of an agenda-driven clerk. This was a lesson both in humility and in assertiveness. Next slide. I'm not sure where we are on the slides. Next slide. Okay. I grew up in a Quaker community hearing many stories about courageous individuals, but not often about courageous groups. It took a long time to unlearn the mindset that I could and should be powerful acting alone and to understand what it is to be part of a team. This group, just go back one slide. This is the group of people that I was with at the Exelon shareholder meeting in Delaware. I think it was 2019. Through Equate, I have had many, many opportunities to experience community, whether as part of a huge group showing up at PNC's headquarters in Pittsburgh. Next slide, please. This was in 2014, I believe. Equate organized busloads of people to go from Friends General Conference to nearby Pittsburgh, where PNC's headquarters were. Again, we had more than 200 people there. Being part of a core team, planning an action, going as a group into a shareholder meetings, or walking across Pennsylvania or around the perimeter of Philadelphia. Next slide. This is part of a walk around Philadelphia. I'm the last person in the line there. Next slide. Obviously outside of Bryn Gwilled Homestead. This is also part of the walk around Philadelphia. Next slide. I have been pushed to stretch and grow, to become bolder, to find my voice, to act with courage, to take risks, to trust others, and to take on new roles. In following this leading, I have also found great joy. This slide is our finale after we completed our successful campaign against PNC. We had a graduation, and just for fun, I wore my father's graduation robe. You can kind of see it on the back. So this is the graduation. Next slide. This was at a during our next campaign against PICO. We had a PICO runaround, and we said the little stickers that said "PICO, get moving," and many people ran around the block, symbolizing the way PICO was just simply avoiding the main topic and giving us the runaround. Next slide. Also at the PICO runaround, it was a joyful occasion. And one more. I found my voice and I have found joy. I would now like you to join with me if you have a book. The last song in the Worship and Song is simply one that is a very joyful song, and I'd like you to join with me in singing. If you're on Zoom, you can sing, but please stay muted. It's on page 335. You shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills will break forth before you. There'll be shouts of joy, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. The trees of the field will clap their hands. The trees of the field will clap their hands, and you'll go out with joy. Once more, you shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills will break forth before you. There'll be shouts of joy, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. The trees of the field will clap their hands. The trees of the field will clap their hands, and you'll go out with joy. So we'll now have a time for worship or worshipful cheering, and I will step back from the microphone.